I hope you're well. I've got something interesting for you today, a little bit different. So, I was recently discussing with a friend the conversations about the scale of the new Star Trek Playmates figures and how the company is saying that they're the same scale, they just happen to be taller to be more realistic. This friend is someone who's been involved in doll making and dollhouse making for many years, and she's even taught me a few tricks for furniture and diorama building and things like that. And after I explained the semi controversy about the figures, I showed her some of the new figures and some of the old figures. And as if it was a casual thing to just say, she held up a Picard figure from the 95 line and said, "These are fat scale dolls." And I said, "Excuse me." She explained to me so that for hundreds of years, doll makers have made dolls in two major ways. The first style is called true scale, and the second is now commonly called baby scale, but has the nicknames fat scale or chubby scale. Um, so, true scale means that all of the dimensions of the doll or the figure are equally divisible by whatever factor the scale has been decided on. So, if it's a 1/6 scale doll, the doll itself will be between about 10 to 12 inches tall, and the ratio of the head to the shoulders and the torso to the legs will all be close to the way a human adult should look. Baby scale, on the other hand, uses the ratios more similar to babies, where the head is larger, the eyes are larger, the arms and legs are shorter to the length of the torso, and this gives the doll or the figure a sort of cutesy look. It's that sort of baby look. There's been a hypothesis about why we commonly find these proportions to be so cutesy. Throughout the history of toys, toys have been made for younger children. We're typically given this sort of baby scale. Uh, some think it helps the child to identify with the toy better, but then as children got older, their toys would look more like the adults. If you consider like Barbies and GI Joes that came out in the 50s and 60s, they were more for older kids. Um, when small children got teddy bears and stuffed dolls, stuffed animals, they used more of those baby scale proportions. Of course, things in the 70s, the scaling of toys got turned upside down mostly as a response to make toys cheaper, leading to the Star Wars figures that came out that were 3 and 3/4 inch figures from 1978 onwards. It also led to G.I. Joe figures and coming back, and they were no longer 12 inches. They were now 3 and 3/4 inch, same as the Star Wars figures. The dimensions were still close to true scale, although the heads were often a little on the large side. Um, but this was fine because it made the face easier to see, it made the painting of the figures easier as well, kept the price down for mom and dad. And then He-Man came along and did everything almost opposite. Now the head was smaller, the proper the head was smaller than the proper scale with massive shoulders, skinny wrists and ankles, and apparently those in the doll community do actually now call this He-Man scale because it's so much different to the other scaling options. Um, what it comes to is that Playmates in the late 80s chose to make figures in a 1/14 scale with this baby or chubby look. Throughout toy history, you've had many variations on scale. Barbie has gone from slightly exaggerated proportions to far closer to realistic. But then you compare that to like the Bratz dolls of a few years ago, where the head and the eyes were massive with a tiny torso and huge feet. So I've said all that to try and explain why we were all confused about the scale of the figures that we had back in the 90s, when Playmates said they were making the new figures in the same scale, but it would result in figures being taller. They were technically correct, but then we get to the reality of the figures. So, if we look at the main cast figures, the 7 main cast figures, 5 are almost the same size: Kirk, Spock, Picard, Data, and Riker, with Saru being a bit taller and Burnham being a bit shorter. But I started looking at how tall the actors are, which does not necessarily determine how tall the character is. For example, Saru is actually 6 inches taller than Doug Jones, the actor who plays Saru. Um, I got screen caps of the characters next to each other, and while the actor playing Spock with Saru and Burnham uh, is different, you have to assume some continuity, and in fairness, Ethan Peck in real life is only an inch taller than Leonard Nimoy was. But Leonard Nimoy was taller than William Shatner's Kirk, and Picard is a little taller than Kirk as well. And in pictures, we can see that Spock might be the slightest bit taller than Picard, but not by much. Then we can see that Data is also a little bit taller than Picard, and here's where it comes to a problem, though. Jonathan Frakes, the actor who plays Riker, has always been significantly taller than Data or Picard. If we assume that Riker is the same height as Jonathan Frakes, then a figure of Riker should be actually 5 inches tall. The result of the Skells being fixed is that Riker is the only figure Playmates actually made correctly to scale. Technically, the Khan figure is potentially as well, but actually understanding how tall that Khan was versus Ricardo Montalban is a bit confusing, and I'm not going to bother with that right now. On the other hand, Picard, Data, Kirk, Spock, and even Burnham is a little bit too big, and Saru is actually way too small. He should be at least another half-inch taller. If you've got a Picard and a Saru, you can even grab them, put them back to the back or face to face, and you'll notice Picard's head is massive compared to Saru, at least double the size. In fact, if you compare Picard's head to all of the others, it's massive in general. I made a joke about them making his heads humped, but it's even worse. They make it look like Patrick Stewart has a giant head. Quickly, I know a lot of people were complaining about the scaling of the hands. I think the problem is we got used to the oversized hands of the old figures. These hands are actually pretty accurate to scale with the body. People often forget how small our hands typically are in comparison to our own body, because it's a part of your body, of your own body, that you see the most. It's always right in front of you. But for most people, the width of your hand laid flat is actually the same as half the width of your face. You can actually test that. Put your hand where your pinky lines up with your nose, and you'll notice that your index finger and your thumb line up with where your ear is. Sounds weird, but artists have been studying the proportions of the human body for 1,000 years. We've found a lot of weird things like that. They're cool. You can check that out some other time. But in summary, how do I feel about how Playmates did on the scale of the first wave of figures? I'm not real pleased. Only one figure is really to proper scale. You say you want to have true scale, but they screw that up probably worse than you ever did using the sort of chubby scaling from the 90s. At least when you have that cartoonish look, there's room for forgiveness. It's kind of like comparing the art styles of the old Funimation Scooby-Doo to the Miyazaki movies. But the thing is, you promised us a Miyazaki quality, and you gave us Scooby-Doo goods. They're still good. They look fine on the shelf next to the old ones, but they are noticeably different. I'll continue to collect these with hope that they'll improve, because that's the best thing we've got. Just like the old line improved as in certain areas as they went on. For example, the articulation actually did get a little bit better as they got into the Voyager figures. Even the sculpting got better later on in the line. It started making them actually look more and more like the actual actors. until the very end when articulation started getting decreased to save money, but that's a separate issue. But I'm going to hope that maybe with the following lines, they'll start to correct some of the scale issues, and that's the best we've got. All right, thanks, and I will see you next time.